nothing but the truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you and the clear truth that emerges. It's the moment of truth for India's G20 presidency. New Delhi is all glitter and sparkle as over 30 top leaders from across the world will attend the summit. This is the most powerful grouping of nations in the world. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership, India's G20 rollout was turned into a national movement. Over 200 plus meetings in some 60 venues across the country were held, and Prime Minister Modi personally supervised the remodeling of Delhi's Pragati Maidan into the Bharat Mandapam, which was achieved in record speed. What it has resulted is in a conference venue that is state of the art, but which also showcases India's rich heritage. Now, as I said, September 9th is the moment of truth. But before we get into the key outcomes of the summit, let's look at the backdrop that this G20 is being held. When India assumed the G20 presidency late last year, the world was already in a state of deep disorder. It was in fact in free fall as a war provoked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, now in its 19th month, saw the big powers line up dangerously against each other. This was, if you recall, immediately after the COVID-19 pandemic had gutted not just our lives, but even the economies of nations, sparking a process of deglobalization that had begun over a decade ago and hastening it. Meanwhile, China, under President Xi Jinping, aggressively pushed for superpower status, challenging American hegemony. China also triggered a border confrontation with India in the midst of COVID, the worst in 50 years, overturning 3 decades of painstakingly crafted confidence-building measures, which were precisely to prevent such an escalation. So therefore, it was in this troubled milieu that India took leadership of the G20 and hoped to lay the foundation of a new world order that would be far more inclusive, harmonious, and compassionate. The slogan India adopted was aspirational but relevant. One Earth, one family, one future. Now, just to get a bit of background, there are always two major tracks in the G20. The finance track has the finance ministers deliberating on issues of things like the international financial architecture, global indebtedness, and the role of multilateral development banks, among other things. And the Sherpa track has as many as 13 working groups that goes into all the key international issues such as development, agriculture, environment, health, education, and of course the maintenance of the rules-based international order. But as the summit neared, there were 3 big power games on that would leave the G20 deeply divided even before the summit began. The first was India-China power game that was on. Chinese President Xi Jinping skipped the summit, as did Russian President Vladimir Putin, for differing reasons. President Xi not coming to Delhi signaled a new low in India-China bilateral ties. It was also meant to take some of the sheen of India's G20 tenure. That was evident even during the meetings of the G20 working groups, with China emerging as the most vociferous objector. This included petty issues such as including the Sanskrit phrases in official communiques, the Chinese saying they would rather have the standard United Nations text that was being used earlier. Just a month and a half before the Delhi summit, there were signs of some forward movement between India and China. National Security Advisor Ajit Doval met China's Special Representative Wang Yi at the BRICS NSA event in Johannesburg on July 24th, and they seemed to be trying to move forward on the dialogue. On August 13th-14th, in the 19th round of the India-China co-commander level talks in Ladakh, the two sides agreed to, and I'm quoting it, resolve the issue in an expeditious manner and continue engaging in negotiations through both military and diplomatic channels, close quote. Yet, when Modi and Xi Prime Minister Modi and President Xi met on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg on August 23rd, any hope of a rapprochement receded, and there was even a needless controversy breaking out over who had sought the meeting, with India claiming China had asked for it and Beijing refuting that assertion and saying no, it was India first that did it. This symbolized the widening gulf between the two countries even before the summit began. A week later, China made matters worse by officially releasing the 2023 edition of its standard map that showed Arunachal Pradesh as part of its territory, besides older claims on Aksai Chin, which External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar dismissed in one word: absurd, he said. To Prime Minister Modi's credit, he refused to make any compromise or concession on the border issue to get President Xi to attend the G20 summit. China had on many occasions wanted India to continue the bilateral dialogue on other issues, even as they worked to sort out the recent border dispute. However, India remained firm and said that till status quo is restored on the Ladakh border for all the areas involved in the May 2020 confrontation that the two countries had, relations with China, as External Affairs Minister Jaishankar put it, will remain abnormal. The second big power game was the China-US dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier, first it was India versus China, but it was not just India that is facing new forms of Chinese aggression. The US has been increasingly concerned about China's hostile intention and its growing ambitions to pose not just an economic challenge to the US, but also a military one, especially in Asian territories that are of core interest to America. President Biden, in fact, expressed his disappointment over President Xi's decision not to attend the G20, as he was hoping to corner the Chinese Supremo on some key issues, both international and domestic. Ashok Kanta, a former Indian ambassador to China, attributes Xi's growing territorial ambitions for China to his grand strategy of strengthening national security in every domain, at the border, at sea, on land, in air, and even in cyberspace. Now, Ambassador Kanta told me China would like to be the premier power of the Asia Pacific. Close quotes. Ultimately, Xi wants to challenge the US predominance on the world stage. Under Xi, China has extended its sphere of influence not just across Asia, but also into Africa and parts of Latin America. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, has seen China fund a string of infrastructure projects in many countries, including in India's neighborhood, spending close to $1 trillion to do so. The US, meanwhile, has moved to contain China on several fronts. Just as it did for India, COVID-19 exposed the US economy's overdependence on China, especially for critical technology like semiconductor chips and pharmaceutical imports. The United States' trade with China was close to $690 billion in 2022, and the deficit in favor of China was as much as $382 billion. Since the US cannot delink its economy from China, as it would be self-defeating, it has adopted a de-risking strategy, and that is to reduce its reliance on China. US companies are opting for a friendshoring or a China plus one policy and relocating a lot of its manufacturing units to friendly nations, including India and Vietnam. To contain China, the dormant quadrilateral dialogue, or Quad, was revised. And this consists of 4 members: India, the US, Japan, and Australia. Now, the Quad nations pledged to support an open, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific that directly challenged China's interests in the region. The US also put together a security group called the AUKUS, which is an acronym for Australia, UK, and the US, to provide nuclear submarines to Australia for patrolling the Indian Ocean, particularly in the areas close to China. Experts see China's recent border aggression against India as a big message to New Delhi that aligning with the US or joining other security groupings like the Quad may not be of much help. Shiv Shankar Menon, the former National Security Advisor, told me, and I'm quoting him, China may be sending a message not to mess with it, and that it has the potential to embarrass the Modi government whenever it suits them. China is also telling the Americans that India is no real counter to China. I close quotes. And then let's look at the third big power play, that is between Russia and China versus major Western nations led by the US. So apart from containing China, US and other Western countries have moved to defang Russia and make it pull back from the Ukraine invasion. Also to break the growing nexus between Russia and China. Meanwhile, India and the US were not on the same page when it came to putting pressure on Russia to end its war on Ukraine and to restore status quo. At the Bali G20 summit in 2022, that's last year, India brokered a compromise leadership declaration that got Russia and China to sign by repeating the text passed in the UN General Assembly and the Security Council, and that text said it deplored the Russian aggression and called for unconditional withdrawal. For the G20 summit in India, however, both Russia and China have not agreed to have the Bali formulation on the Ukraine war as part of the Delhi Declaration. And that puts that declaration into some sort of trouble unless it is negotiated properly. And one of the reasons President Xi avoided coming to Delhi was that in Putin's absence, he would bear the brunt of all this criticism. Meanwhile, the US, Europe, and other major countries have been pressing India to come out with a tough stance on the invasion. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in fact, wanted India to invite Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky to address the G20 summit as he had done in Bali. However, as D.B. Venkatesh Verma, a former Indian ambassador to Russia, a very knowledgeable person, told me, and he said, given India's close relations with Russia and also its dependence on it for defense, oil and fertilizers, India took the right decision not to impact its bilateral relations with Russia as well as its core national interests. Also, Russia has a few friends and doesn't want to lose India. This is what Venkatesh Verma told me. So India was firm that at the G20 in Delhi, discussion on the Ukraine war would be kept to the minimum. Asked whether India would push for a solution to the Russia-Ukraine war at the G20 summit, Prime Minister Modi, in an exclusive interview to the India Today group, said, and I'm quoting him, "You should assess whether it is desirable to link G20 or our G20 presidency to this issue. There are problems in other parts of the world, like Syria, in some countries in Africa, and in East Asia, in Latin America. There are international organizations like the United Nations that are focusing on these issues. My focus is that we will steer the G20 presidency to build a common position on development that is of importance for the global South." And I close quotes. In fact, becoming the voice and the champion of the global South may turn out to be India's single largest contribution to the New Delhi G20, for which credit should go to Prime Minister Modi. Under his instructions, Indian negotiators handling key groupings pushed for greater representation of issues concerning the global South. And these encompass a whole range that interest both emerging and developing economies. I spoke to Amitabh Kant, who's India's Sherpa for the G20, and he told me, among the key achievements, and I'm quoting him, among the key achievements of this G20 is that India has been the voice of the global South. It has covered a lot of ground for bringing the developing and emerging markets together, and it was Prime Minister Modi who pushed for making the African Union a permanent member. Now, elaborating on some of the measures that India had pushed through, Amitabh Kant told me, and I quote him again, with 1/3 of the world in recession, we pushed for a globally sustainable growth. We also wanted to accelerate the pace of implementation of the sustainable development goals, because post-COVID, a lot of people went below the poverty line. So that required not just green action, but also finances and a green bank to facilitate it. As climate action needed finance, it also called for reform of the existing multilateral development financial institutions. And very importantly, Amitabh Kant told me, to ensure financial inclusion, the digital public infrastructure that India has worked on is now critical for the world and finds a prominent place in the G20 declarations. As critical and this is something that India pushed, was nurturing the role of women-led development. Now, just to give you an example, on the financial track, the working groups were able to move the ball considerably forward on all the key issues that were before it and had come up with innovative approaches. Take one example on the question of financial inclusion. There are as many as 1.4 billion people across the globe who do not have a bank account. More than 1 billion are unable to prove their identity and take access to vital services such as healthcare and education and finance. At the G20 working group on this subject, India using its digital public infrastructure, or DPI as it's called, as an example, pushed for what is known as a Financial Inclusion Action Plan spanning the next 3 years, that's between 2024 to 2026. This would serve as a roadmap for other developing countries to follow what India had done. Now, I spoke to Economic Affairs Secretary Ajay Seth, who chaired the G20 meetings of finance deputies, and he told me India's population-wide example of digital public infrastructure gave it strong credentials to argue that such infrastructure would not only achieve financial inclusion, but very importantly enable the private sector to gain efficiency and productivity, and I close quotes. So there are many other such big decisions on key areas that have been worked out, including reforming the multilateral development banks and funds to make future cities more green. There is also a very important cryptocurrency announcement that is going to be made. Importantly, right from the beginning of India's G20 presidency last November, Prime Minister Modi has personally monitored all deliberations and pushed for deliverables, especially outcomes. Harsh Shringla, former Foreign Secretary and Chief Coordinator for G20, told me, and I quote him, India introduced the concept of working for the global common good, what the Prime Minister calls human-centric globalization, where nations collaborate to solve major issues. That is the new world order that is emerging. The New Delhi G20 has made a good start in that direction. For more details, read my cover story in the latest issue of India Today that has covered all these issues in depth with regard to New Delhi's G20. Thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.